if you have questions or comments for us, we will be looking at the chat, so please feel free to put them in there. So want to do a land acknowledgement before we go any further. And we like to at YW acknowledge that we reside on the traditional land of the Massachusetts people, past and present, and whose name was appropriated by the Commonwealth. We reside on the ancestral unceded lands of the Massachusetts people, and we pay respect to this land and the people who have stewarded it over the years. So we always like to start our presentations with that. Now I'll tell you a little bit about YW Boston, who we are and what we do. So our mission statement is the same mission statement for over 200 YWCAs in the country. And that mission statement is to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. And not surprisingly, like many institutions in Massachusetts, we are the first YWCA in the country, established in 1866. And even though we all share the same mission, we are allowed to execute on that mission in a way that we feel will have the most impact in our community. And so at YW Boston, we focus on, and our vision is to help organizations create more inclusive spaces and environments so that women, people of color, and especially women of color can thrive at all levels. And so that's the work that we have been focusing on for about 4 years now. And our work consists of programs and other activities. So our first bucket of work, which I'll talk a little more deeply about in the next slide, is our diversity, equity, and inclusion services. And that work is really working with organizations across sectors to help them get both a critical mass of people within the organization to understand what the challenges are internally and feel that they have the knowledge, tools, and skills to move that work forward. It also works with mid to senior level managers as well, because often they need additional support in this area. And we have advocacy work that we do because we know that there are challenges outside of organizations that have impacts on organizations being able to create inclusive environments and for people to take advantage of that. And so that's where our advocacy program and work steps in. And then we do a program FIRE for middle school girls, because for many, and particularly women of color, but for many women, they're in leadership positions in part because they had opportunities when they were younger. And we realized that there was a lack of opportunity for middle school girls in the Boston area. And so we have our FIRE program that works with them. And then lastly, thought leadership. And this is an opportunity for us to both share what we're learning from the work that we're doing, as well as to elevate other experts in the field so that people can hear what are best practices, what's working, and ideally take those back to their own community. As I shared, and you'll see in the next slide, that our diversity, equity, and inclusion services consists of workshops like we're doing today. And on the one hand, I'm sorry to share bad news in that the workshop is not going to fix all your problems. But the good news is we hope that you'll leave with some more information and some tools and frameworks that you can use to move the work forward internally. And that's what our workshops do. We also do a program called Inclusion Boston. That's a deeper dive with a smaller group of people within an organization that ultimately leads to an action plan that we help the organization implement for a year. Our Lead Boston program works with mid to senior level executives because we have found in our work, and the research also supports, that when organizations are looking to do this work, leadership can be on board. There could be a lot of excitement, but it's often middle to senior level managers that are asked to move the work forward, and they don't always feel like they have the tools. And that's what Lead Boston does. It helps to equip them so they feel empowered and to be able to make change internally. And as I shared, we do our workshops. And again, our workshops are really about to share knowledge, tools, definitions, and frameworks. So next slide will be Catherine.
Thanks. So I know many of us have been using Zoom for quite a while now, but did want to take a moment just to introduce a few ways we'll be using it. And I think it's always worth a reminder. I can say that I'm on here all the time and yet continually forget to unmute myself. So we'll be using, we want to have some opportunities for folks to engage both in some breakout rooms later, but also throughout. So please do use the chat function to ask questions or offer comments. You can also use the raise hand, and we'll be trying to keep an eye on that throughout. We are going to be doing a few questions to get feedback from all of you. So we'll be doing a few exercises that ask you to include a response to our question in the chat, and then we'll be asking a few folks to unmute to share a little bit more about the answer you provided. We are also going to be really want an opportunity for folks to recognize where we share different challenges and opportunities. So if you hear a comment from someone else that resonates for you, use those reaction options that you have to, over here to help folks know, like, that really resonated for me. We can use the thumbs up, the clap, smiley face, different things to let folks know, like, yes, I'm having that challenge too at our organization, or we had a similar experience, and so on, so that we can get a sense of themes and trends amongst all of us participating today. And then finally, just want to, while we encourage folks to keep video enabled, I know that's not always a possibility. So ultimately, we really want everybody to practice self-care, stretch, take a break if you need to. Guest stars are welcome, your coworkers are welcome, the pets coming through behind you on the screen. It's all good. We want to have a really great and comfortable conversation. So to review our objectives for today, we hope to develop a shared understanding of some of the key concepts of organizational change and how that can help create an inclusive workplace. We're going to introduce a few frameworks for change efforts, learn to identify some barriers to inclusion within an organization, and we'll use a case study approach to do that. And that's where those small group breakout sessions will happen. And we hope to increase our knowledge of strategies to address systemic racial inequities within organizations. And to echo what Beth said, we really hope that you walk away with a few tools, resources, new pieces of information that you can apply back at your workplace. And that's really where the work will happen. And also to frame much of what we're doing today is very similar to a workshop we offer by the same title. That said, if you were to do a workshop with us, you'd find a lot more opportunities for interpersonal engagement and activity that just weren't available given the time frame we have today. But wanted to acknowledge that that's the primary difference you'd notice between our conversation today and one of our workshops is the level of interaction that we try to encourage. Oops. So I want to talk a little bit about what is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we can think about it, diversity is diversity of people and perspectives. And what we're really thinking about there is variety. It is the report that tells you demographically who's in your organization, who's represented and who's not represented. And what, emphasizes how many of this group do we have in our organization or on our leadership team. And diversity programs and the cultural celebrations, education programs are not equivalent to doing racial equity work. We can celebrate different cultures and traditions without actually doing the work to dismantle inequitable systems and policies. So diversity is one key element, but it's not the whole thing. And also want to clarify that diversity is not an adjective to describe a person or a group of people. So oftentimes we hear we have diverse people in our organization. What that can often be a euphemism for trying to describe we have people of varied racial identities in our organization. And the more we can be clear about our language, the better. Inclusion is really providing power, voice within an organizational culture and sort of transforming that organizational culture. And it's more an intentional effort to transform the status quo. So we create opportunity for people who have been historically marginalized within organizations. And it really needs to begin and center with the wants, needs, and quality of life of those who have been historically marginalized and without access to power. And finally, we would think about equity. That's looking at the results of changes to policies, practices, and that's where we can get to belonging. So we think about belonging occurring when there's true equity within an organization. It's a feeling of a sense of being heard and valued. And I wanted to provide a quote that might be familiar to a lot of you from our Lead Boston alum, Vernee Myers. Diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. And to give a little bit more and really help frame how we at YW Boston think about our work, it's helpful sometimes to think about what something is not in order to think about what it is. So DEI efforts are not one and done solutions, a checkbox, or only one team's or one individual's responsibility. They are ongoing cross-functional work that's continuous, inclusive, and accountable. And I'd say that everyone within an organization has a role and a responsibility for advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what needs to change? We talk a lot about what we call the 4 I's. And so this is how systemic inequities can often show up at different levels and layers of organizations, communities, countries, systems such as a education system, healthcare system, and so on. And we're gonna, in just a moment, Beth's gonna lead you in a couple of exercises to look at this in more detail, but I wanted to provide a quick overview of those 4 I's. So when we think about the ideological, it's the assumptions and beliefs and messages that reinforce systems of inequity and drive social injustices. So an example of that could be in our media and in our popular culture in terms of who's presented as heroes in our movies, who's typically presented as villains in our movies, and what messages, beliefs is that reinforcing and conveying. And if we look at the institutional, think about bias and discriminatory policies and practices that result in an equitable distribution of resources. And one example of that could be a lot of organizations have a blanket practice of saying all jobs candidates must have at a minimum a BA, a college degree of some sort, without really looking at, is that true? In order to do every job here, do you have to have a BA? And so that, even if it wasn't intentionally put in place to have a disparate impact, may be resulting in inequitable opportunities. And if we look at the bottom left-hand side, internalized. So this is bias and prejudice that manifests within ourselves that give thoughts and feelings about our own racial superiority or inferiority. And it's influenced by the messages we receive from the dominant culture. So within an organization, if there's no one on the leadership team that looks like me, I might wonder whether I might not even put myself up for a promotion or try to get a promotion or apply for that next job because I think those kinds of opportunities aren't for me. And finally, interpersonal. This is what I think a lot of us often think about when we talk about racism and discrimination. It's the things that happen among individuals that are informed by racial stereotypes. And this can also be called racial prejudice. So for example, within a workplace, perhaps in a department, there are only 2 Black women in that department and your colleague continually mistakes one for the other. Be an example of interpersonal. So Beth's gonna give us some opportunities to think about this a little bit more and practice.
Sorry, I couldn't find my little thingy to unmute myself. All right. So we're going to do a quick check for understanding, and I'm going to ask you to use the chat function. And so I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to read it. You can read it on the screen. I will read it out loud and ask you to say, is this internalized, institutional, ideological, or interpersonal? Thinking about the 4 I's, where would you put it? And in some cases, you might put this comment in multiple eyes. And then once people put their thoughts in the chat, I will ask 1 or 2 people to unmute and just share what they picked and why. And so the first one is, you're on a Zoom meeting when a colleague mispronounces a board member's name again. When alerted to the mistake, your colleague says, sorry, it's such an unusual name. And please put in the chat, is this an example of internalized, institutional, ideological, and or interpersonal? Now, I don't know if this is peer pressure, but there is a lot. Okay, now I'm seeing some different ones. Before it was all interpersonal. Now I see a couple of others popping up. All right, I think we've had just about everybody answer. So I would love to get 2 people to unmute and to say which one they picked and why. Going first is always the hardest. Feel free just to unmute and share. You can also raise your hand. I'm looking, I don't see any hand raised. And someone asked if they could see the 4 I's again, I guess to help with their answer. All right, folks, we're not moving unless I get a couple of volunteers, so.
Well, I'm happy to volunteer if
Thank you, Scott.
that's okay. I'm hesitant to be the white male making noise, but at the same time, I'm happy to make some noise.
Great, so what did you pick?
Well, at first I picked the one that a lot of other people picked, which is the interpersonal. But I thought that, and I picked that because it's about one person making a statement to another person that shows a lack of sensitivity. But I also thought that there might be an institutional component if, in fact, there's a culture in the institution where making such a statement that shows a lack of sensitivity is considered to be okay.
Great, thank you. And if I can get one other person to go who maybe picked ideological or internalized, just to share a different response and perspective.
Well, shall I go?
Please.
I picked the ideological, just the word unusual. That's an assumption, unusual to that person speaking, but not necessarily to others.
Great, thank you, Lynn. All right, so we will go on to the second one. Your organization's dress code includes 2 lists of restrictions organized by gender. And again, please put in the chat, is that internalized, institutional, ideological, or interpersonal, or a combination? Terrific. All right, may I get 2 different people to share their responses, please?
I'll go. I said institutional because it's a policy, it's a policy and practice throughout the whole agency.
Great. And one other person?
I'll go. I had selected institutional as well as internalized because, as the previous speaker said, it's institutional, it's in the company policy. I had put in the internalized because I think people just gloss over it. It's just that's, you know, they're so used to it. Oh, boys are this, girls are this. So, and I think it could probably go ideological as well, but I think we're, you know, if we had a dress code that's like blacks, you know, and white dress code, racially based, everyone would be like, what? But somehow the gender is just so internalized that, you know, that's why I selected that.
Great. Thank you, Janet. And there was a question that came up in the chat, and some of the examples that we will use that we talk about are not going to focus just on race, since there are other groups that are that face oppression in organizations. So we will get examples like the last one that looks at gender, for example. So just wanted to say that we won't focus entirely on race in our presentation.
Beth, I'd chime in and say also the intersectional impacts can oftentimes disproportionately, of a dress code like this, can disproportionately impact Black women within the workplace, particularly dress code that can touch on what's appropriate hairstyle and so on.
Great, thank you, Catherine. And before I forget, that's a great point too, in just thinking about how the intersections of identity can show up in an organization. Oftentimes organizations might look at a situation and look at just one group. So how are men doing versus women? How are people of color doing versus white people? But it's really important to go layers deeper than that, because sometimes if you identify as a woman who's a woman of color, that your information may look very differently than somebody who identifies as a white woman, and how you're progressing potentially in your organization may differ because of multiple identities. All right, so now I want to talk about the ecological model and really thinking about how do you make change in an organization. And so we know that there is a system of oppression, and the examples Catherine gave, some were internal to an organization, some were external in the world, and thinking about how do those things show up within an organization. And so the way that we like to think about it at YW Boston is looking at 3 levels within an organization: the micro, the meso, and the macro. And how do the systems of oppression, or how do the elements of the 4 I's show up in each of these levels within an organization? Because ultimately, to get to change, we have to think of how we're addressing each of these levels. What levers are we pushing to get the organization to change? And so the first is the micro, and that's often where you'll see intrapersonal and internalized issues show up. And that's really, what is the knowledge that people have? What are their attitudes and behaviors around different identities? What do they believe about themselves? What are their skill sets? And what is their history of understanding, both within their organizational, what is the cultural context and the history in dealing with different groups, and what happens in the world, both previously and currently. The meso level is thinking about the culture of an organization, and what are the formal and informal social networks? How do people find support within an organization? And thinking outside of an organization, thinking about groups you may belong in, thinking about, you know, family structures, friend networks. But within an organization, what are the formal and informal groups, and what are the cultures of those groups? And that has a lot of the interpersonal interactions and thinking of the 4 I's. And then lastly is the macro level, and that's really looking at what are policies and practices within an organization. And that's really getting at the institutional level and thinking about, again, you know, formal and informal policies and practices, rules and regulations, and how is that influencing the organization. Thinking about what's going on in the community, what is the relationship with other organizations and institutions, and is that having an impact on how is that impacting what's happening within an organization? And then lastly, public policy. and how is that influencing what's happening? And so again, in order to make change within an institution, it's important to look at all three of these levels and figure out what are the levers that are going to make sense to push to try to get at all the ways that the 4 I's are showing up internally. So now we're going to do another check for understanding. And I'm going to have you, there are 4 different situations, and ask you again in the chat to say, how does this, how would you define this? Is this a micro issue? Is this a meso issue? Or is this a macro issue? So the first one is asking a colleague to touch their hair. So we're seeing in the responses, many are micro, and there have been, I think the second is micro and meso, and then we have 1 for macro. So I would love to get 2 people again to share what are they, why did they pick the one that they picked, or if they picked 2, why they picked those 2.
I can share.
Great.
I picked micro because it was interpersonal to 2 people, and I just kind of laughed to myself that apparently this must happen a lot because it's always an example and like every training I'm gonna go to. So
Yes.
which is
Yeah, I can just share a story. My daughter and I this summer were up in New Hampshire, and some person walked by. My daughter had her hair in braids and just felt like she could touch my daughter's hair. Didn't ask, nothing, just said, "Oh, isn't your hair cute?" and started touching my daughter's hair. Who else would like to go? That picked a different answer for that one.
I can go. I picked micro and meso because I think, micro is about like the person's kind of internalized feelings and, understanding that makes them feel like it's appropriate to ask someone about touching their hair. And then the meso because of the interaction is between the 2 people.
Great, thank you both. Second one is clear policies for promotion, micro, meso, or macro. All right. So we've got, okay, we had a bunch of people that said macro. So I would love for if people put either meso or micro to share why you picked those. And it's not that they're wrong. So there's no right or wrong answer here, but I'd love, since most people said macro, I'd love to hear how people put it in the other categories.
I can go.
Great.
I chose micro and macro because I feel that it's clearly is a macro. It's in the macro, but also I chose micro because I feel that regularly, like people of color is, and this happened to me personally when I'm trying to stay explaining something, and there is other people that try to explain it better in a meeting or something. So I feel that there is this belief that we need instruction and we need guidance, that we cannot do it for ourselves. And also when there is like there is like a woman of color in a position of like, you know, leadership, it's like sometimes she gets a lot questioned about the decisions that she takes. So I feel that there is also the micro factor in there.
Yeah, that's great, Carolina. Thank you so much for sharing. Anybody else have something to add on this one?
If it's all right, I'll just chime in. This is Anthony. I was going to say
Please.
that it just, yeah, I believe it's macro, but everything sort of starts at the beginning, the influence, you know, and kind of pushes all the, and like if we can work on the macro, that's going to affect if we can work on the micro, that's going to affect the macro. But you got, you know, ideas that work their way through the system. So
Right.
that was my
Excellent.
thought.
Yeah, thank you both. That was great, Anthony. And again, Carolina, thank you. And last one, providing formal feedback only to people who have similar social identities. Micro, meso, macro, or a combination. All right, so I would say so far, this is probably the one that more people are saying falls into all three than either of the other two. So I would love to get just a couple people again to share what they picked and why, and particularly if someone picked all three, that would be great to hear why you picked all three.
I chose all three. The micro level, because I do think it is interpersonal to provide feedback to individuals. Maybe there's a reason why you choose to do it for only certain social identities, ones that, you know, are similar to your own. For the meso, because it states that it's a formal process. So I thought that that was appropriate, it fell in there. And then macro, because it can be institutional culture in terms of what generally happens in terms of networking. And it does fall into policy as well.
Great, thank you, Kim. Does anyone have anything to add? All right, hearing none, I will let you guys off the hook on this one and just let one person go. And we'll go to the next slide. So now we've talked about all of the different things to be thinking about, right? And so that this is a system, it's not necessarily that people are bad actors or intentionally are acting badly, but there's a system that we're all a part of. And so we have to think about how all those pieces of the system, the four eyes, connect and how do we disrupt that. We spent a little time talking about how and thinking about the three parts of an institution or an organization, the micro, the meso, the macro, how those connect with each other, and again, how they're influenced by this system of oppression. So now we're going to talk about how do we enact change? How do we think about moving our organization along the DE&I journey? So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to look at the chart that is up there. I'll read it through also to just to be helpful for folks, and then ask you to think about where you would place your organization along the DE&I journey. And a second question, if I were external to your organization or anyone external to your organization, where would they put your organization? So the first one is, where do you place your organization on the journey? And the second is, if I was an external person and if I looked on your website, if I looked at any of your materials, if I went into your offices, where would I put it? And so the first one on the journey is exclusive. And that's an organization that intentionally and publicly excludes or segregates African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and other marginalized groups. Passive is tolerant of a limited number or token people of color or members from other social identity groups allowed in because they have the proper perspective and credentials. So we have a couple from different groups, and we often declare we don't have a problem because we got a couple of folks that identify as people of color, as LGBTQ community members. Symbolic change, an organization that makes official statements on diversity efforts. Perhaps this summer, some organizations might come to mind. Sees itself as a non-racist institution, carries out intentional inclusive efforts, but is still relatively unaware and has little or no contextual change. The next is identity change. Growing understanding of racism as a barrier to effective diversity, develops an analysis of systemic racism internally, but institutional structures and culture that resides still maintains racism, and it's still intact and relatively untouched. Then we have structural change. This is an organization that commits to a process of intentional restructuring based upon anti-racist analysis, audits the organization to ensure full participation of people of color and other marginalized groups, implement structures, policies, and practices with inclusive decision-making, and then lastly, fully inclusive. An institution's life reflects full participation and shared power with diverse racial, cultural, and economic groups, and there's a sense of restored community and mutual caring. So again, we'll give you a couple of minutes to think about where you view your own organization, and then where you think people outside of your organization view you. All right, so we are going to put you into breakout groups and ask you to share with it within your group where you put your organization, where you think others would place your organization, and why you believe that there is a difference. And then we'll come back and have one or two groups share some of the themes that came out. And so again, we'll give you about 9 minutes in a small group to have that discussion.
Could you put the question in the chat, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Beth, let me know when you've done that. I
Okay.
put them earlier, but it'd be good to put them back in, and then I can open up the
Yep.
rooms.
All right,
Oh,
hold on
sorry,
a sec.
6 different questions.
Oops. All right. Got it here. Hold on a sec. There we go.
Great. Okay. It's going to be 9 minutes in the breakout rooms.
All right, welcome back. I say this every time, but it's always good when everybody comes back. I'm always afraid that we send people off and they don't return. So it's great to see everybody's Zoom faces on here. So I would love to get 3 groups to share just what came out of your discussions. And I don't want you to share it. You don't have to share the name of your organization because I want people to feel comfortable sharing, but it'd be great to hear where people put their organizations and if there were differences sort of in the group about where external or stakeholders may see you versus where you saw you. Who would like to go first?
I'll go for breakout room 3. My name is Bethany. So we all actually had some pretty similar things going on with we're all from different organizations, and we all felt we were kind of in the symbolic area. We felt like, we were making some really great steps, but we had a lot more steps to go. And I think one interesting thing from the conversation is when we look to the outside, I think everybody sees things differently. Some people will be like, oh, great, your organization made a statement this year because of events, where other people might view it as, oh, well, you should have been doing that a long time ago. So I think it's hard to say how people kind of view the organization. So we all kind of felt the same on that, but it could be really difficult because some people think we should have been doing this work way before, and other people feel good because we're just doing the work.
Great. Thank you, Bethany. How about someone else from their group?
Hi, I can go. From group 4, we talked about 2, I thought were 2 of the most interesting things were it really depends on the lens. So if you're a stakeholder versus a donor versus, somebody that we're working more directly with, all those groups of people are going to have a different feeling about where we're at. We've worked really hard on this in our agency, and I think we're past symbolic, but that's just my opinion. And also I was, I guess not surprised, but also surprised that some board members are more cautious about what to do with this kind of information.
So interesting. Can you share a little more on why they're cautious or what they're cautious about sharing?
I don't know if the group members want to speak to that, but I would just say some are feeling like that's more of a political statement and they don't want to get into a political statement. And some, I think, feeling like they don't want to be chastised for making a statement if the person on the outside feels like they have more work to do in DEI.
Great, thank you, Gina, for sharing. And we can have one more before we move on.
I can go. We talked a little bit about how within an organization and with external stakeholders, there could be really different perceptions of where the organization is. And I think that's the case for us, because I would put us at symbolic or identity, but I am sure that many people in leadership would put us at a higher category. And I'm guessing that maybe some community members or other stakeholders might put us on the lower end, especially since some of the things that we've done are very internal, like pay study around race and gender kind of things that nobody would know about. So yeah, there's definitely many perceptions for each organization.
Yeah, great, thank you. And one thing you shared, Kate, which I think is also important for organizations to be thinking about is, within your organization, who would think what and why, right? And if leadership is thinking you're one place, but many of your entry-level staff or even admin staff are thinking you're someplace else, why might there be a disconnect? And what can happen to help bridge that gap, right? And the same, Gina, for things that came up with the board, right? Understanding why the board may have the perspective that they have. And if there are concerns, how do you address those concerns so it's not potentially holding the organization back? So thank you all for your comments.
I told you I forgot to unmute myself all the time. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about a couple of additional slides and then set us up to go into different breakout groups to have a conversation focused on a case study and hopefully bring all of the expertise that's in this space with all of you, as well as apply some of the information we've shared today. And hopefully that'll be a rich conversation. So really digging in at the domains of macro level change, these are some of the things we're thinking about when we think about institutional change, that there's a lot of different levers, including our hiring, some of the things that you've mentioned just now in the report out, culture, decision-making, promotion structure, all our processes and systems. But much of this that we're sharing here is fairly HR focused, but there's a role, really thinking about what is the role for marketing and communications if you have that staff. What is the role for any research and evaluation staff? How are they thinking about macro level change? And in addition, your finance staff. So who are, what vendors do you work with? How are you being intentional about supply, the racial diversity of your suppliers and external partners providing services at your organization? With decision-making, thinking about, that decision-making includes multiple perspectives. And then, a lot of organizations may have someone who's specifically focused on advancing diversity, equity, inclusion. That's increasingly those roles are being created. But how is that person, how is their work integrated top to bottom across all teams and all departments? And Beth, I know, I think this is something you feel really strongly about. Is there anything I've missed that you'd want to add in?
No, I think you covered it. I'll just emphasize that, every team within the organization does these things, right? Every group has promotions, every group has a culture, every group has a leader, every group thinks about retention. And so it's easy to default to say this all falls to human resources or our HR/operations person, but really it falls to everybody within the team and within the organizations, because all of these processes are happening, within groups as well as across the org.
And as we think at YW Boston, I think we think about using for our goal setting a variation on the SMART framework. I think a lot of us are familiar with the SMART framework of creating goals that are strategic, measurable, ambitious, realistic, and time-bound. The SMART E goal also includes inclusive and equitable. And we find this really helpful in both in our own work, but working with our partner organizations, because oftentimes the goals have been set and the thought about being inclusive and equitable happens after. And how can we really make it an intentional part of the goal setting process itself so that it is woven in and being considered from the start? So just to talk a little bit more about the inclusive piece, thinking about goals that are inclusive, bringing in the voices of employees or stakeholders, volunteers, donors, whatever it might look like at your organization, particularly those most impacted by the work, into processes, activities, decision-making in a way that is sharing power. Oftentimes there can be a fine line between inclusion and tokenism, and that fine line is often power. Are we kind of giving a nod by having a focus group where folks provide an opinion, or are we really saying these opinions are going to shape the decision-making, and in what way? And then equitable, thinking about, are the goals and objectives being created Is there an element of fairness, justice? Are we seeking with this goal to address systemic inequities, and how? So we're going to look at a case study to try and help our case study organization become more equitable. And Madeline's going to put in the chat a link to a URL that has some of the tools we shared earlier, including the DEI journey diagram for your use, as well as a copy of the case study. So you don't need to memorize it when we look at it in a moment. And we're going to ask you in small groups to talk about where you think the organization is on their DEI journey. Consider some interventions at the micro, meso, and macro level, and use the Smarty tool to outline a plan of action for the organization. And we'll take, I believe we're going to take 15 minutes in small groups and breakouts for that discussion. We'll have time for some report out. I don't think all groups will be able to report out, but we can also use the chat for that as well. And let me check the, great. And I know some folks need to head out, which is fine. And I hope you had an opportunity to grab that resource packet on your way so you have access.
All right, welcome back. So I would love to get a couple of groups to share, you know, how will you help Rachel, let alone help the kids, right? So we had some questions we wanted you to talk about. Where do you think the organization is on the journey and why? And what are some things at the different levels of the organization that you think could use some interventions? And then share maybe one thing that you might have, if you got to it, put on the Smarty tool for how you might help this team get to their goals of hiring a team, another team member. So who would like to go?
I can go because, well, I felt very odd about this as a Rachel who is in her late 30s. Our group felt that Rachel from Help the Kids needed some diversity training for herself. She seems like she has a singular focus. Case study Rachel is the worst. Agreed, Kate Wallace. She needs some refocusing, and our group felt that we don't know if the whole organization of Help the Kids, but her particular team, if I'm going back to the organizational DEI journey, was in the probably passive state, or possibly like symbolic, maybe, because she may be like, look at all this work we do with the kids, isn't it great? But like, they're not actually doing anything, right? So we felt like they were somewhere down on that end. It felt like Rachel and her team needed to go through some DEI training, and that should happen sooner rather than later. And I was sincerely hoping that if Rachel's a program manager, that there would be people above her who would be approving her hires, who would have more DEI training than Rachel does, because her team should be representative of the community that she's serving. Or at least moving in that direction. Like one of the things we've been working on is that, by the nature of the organizations that we are in and where we've started, we all have these white supremacist tendencies, and we need to grow out of them and change them. And this particular organization needs to do that. So yeah, so our Smarty goal was get some DEI training and get it pretty darn quick so that they can move forward with hiring to represent their community.
All right, thank you. Excellent. You are clearly a different Rachel, is one of the comments. Can we get feedback from a second group?
I'll go. Well, we talked about the hiring committee and needing obviously to search for people who represent the people they serve, and having maybe a youth or somebody that was in the program in the past be on the hiring committee. Having the hiring committee itself be more diverse than the employees are on that team. So that was one of the SMART goals would be to create a hiring committee that actually reflects the people they serve.
Excellent. And where did your team place them, Amy, on the journey?
I don't have the chart right in front of me, but it wasn't, it was between passive and the one to the left of it.
Okay, fair enough. All right, let's see. If I can look at my chart. Okay, so between exclusive and passive, okay, great. And how about another team? Can we get a third team to go? And particularly a team maybe looked at something, a different way of either looking at hiring or if there was something else you looked at.
Well, we talked about, first of all, needing to like the whole column about family, and like that all just needs to go away immediately as far as time defined goals of Smarty. But we also noted that the woman who may become pregnant was looked at as a detriment, but the man might be harder working since he so problems there. But so we talked about how this organization probably needs a whole like assessment of their culture also. One thing we talked about is like defining processes and fit so it's not so subject to bias and white supremacist structures and habits, and really defining these things, where if you have a human resources team, they should be helping to do that. But really, what are the skill sets, not relying on this nebulous idea of fit that is so subject to all the forms of racism and layers of racism that we've talked about today.
Right. And it's often code, right? You can use
totally
to say to exclude lots of groups, right? But because you say culture, then it seems to be okay, right? But it's just another way, a coded way to exclude groups. And I think something that's come up in all of the groups is really thinking about what is their process for hiring? How do you train people on doing that in a way that is also legal, right? Because some of the questions they asked are actually illegal. And they could get sued for, if that came out for, for ways that they were making decisions to hire or not hire someone. So it's not only about, sort of the right way to do it. It's also about legally, how are you exposing the organization if you don't have the appropriate training when you're doing this work. And we have time for one more group to share, particularly if you had something that might be a little different than what's been shared with the three groups that have gone so far.
I don't mind going if no one else goes.
Yeah, please.
So in our group, we talked about the bias on the assumption of what fun is. So the topic of lacrosse is a culturally specific group. In the inner city, that's not even available in most high schools. So that's something that is off the plate for a lot of people. If you're looking for diversity without saying you're looking for certain people, there's an assumption that the woman that's going to get pregnant is because of the ethnicity she has. Like, why? There's a correlation between that. That's an assumption, like a bias. And also the lack of accommodating her current staff is not going to help with her future staff that she hires, because if someone's not feeling comfortable to a very specific form of fun, which is like the way she goes out, then the different ethnicity or different cultures, different religions that come with the different ethnicities will not coincide with her ideas of success. And then there's definitely a break. Two groups, the people you serve and the people who serves with you, it doesn't match. The mission is not matching with the staff. And that's being intentional. And yeah, I did agree. Like, there were so many things in our group that was a huge HR issue. So, but that's my feedback.
Great. Well, thank you, Alicia. Appreciate you sharing. So we are at our time, but before we go, I want to let Madeline have the last 30 seconds. Before I do that, just on behalf of Catherine and myself, really want to thank you for participating this late morning / afternoon. We really enjoyed it. I appreciate all the feedback that you gave us and conversations that you engaged in, and hopefully you found it rewarding as well. Madeline.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Beth, for this wonderful workshop and for sharing these valuable resources and information with us. And I guess thank you to everyone for joining us this morning and for your wonderful participation. I just want to quickly remind everyone that the recording and the slides will be sent to your email following this morning's program. We'll also be sending out a survey link, so if you could let us know any feedback on today's program, in addition to some links to the upcoming programs. Huge thank you again to Catherine and Beth, and hope everyone is doing well out there.
Everyone, thank you.